My name is Kareem Khalifa, and today we'll be talking about multiple quantifiers. Okay, so today what we'll do is we'll look at multiple quantifiers in sort of two different incarnations. In the first case, we have multiple quantifiers, but we're using the same quantifiers. And in the second case, what we'll do is we'll look at multiple quantifiers where we use both the universal and the existential quantifier in a single expression. Okay, let's start with expressions in which there are multiple quantifiers, but they're the same one. So they'll look like double universal quantifiers like you see on the left, or double existential quantifiers like you see on the right. Okay, so let's start with a case where we have multiple universal quantifiers. I don't know why I came up with this example, but this is the one we're using. Every sugar fiend loves every dessert. So how do we go about translating this? I suggest we sort of break this up into a series of smaller tasks. Now, if we just didn't even worry about multiple quantifiers, we might think that it looks something like this. We're sort of just importing our lessons from earlier discussions to this example. And basically we'd say for all x, if x is a sugar fiend, then x loves every dessert. And as you can see, the consequent of that embedded conditional, right, is something we're going to need to unpack. But I think this is just a good way of seeing what's going on. It's sort of postponing the multiple quantifiers until we absolutely need to bring them in. And we'll show you how to do that in the next step. The key to seeing how this works is you actually know how to just translate that phrase in the consequent that's now in bright orange, right? X loves every dessert. You can kind of just sort of ignore the rest of this complex statement and just focus on what to do with that. And you'll see that it sort of is something that's very natural given the other stuff that you've learned. So how do we go about translating this? I suggest we sort of break this up into a series of smaller tasks. Now, if we just didn't even worry about multiple quantifiers, we might think that it looks something like this. We're sort of just importing our lessons from earlier discussions to this example. And basically we'd say for all x, if x is a sugar fiend, then x loves every dessert. And as you can see, the consequent of that embedded conditional, right, is something we're going to need to unpack. But I think this is just a good way of seeing what's going on. It's sort of postponing the multiple quantifiers until we absolutely need to bring them in. And we'll show you how to do that in the next step. Let's go through this very, very slowly and deliberately just to make sure we have all the steps. Right, so we're now just really focusing on x loves every dessert. And what we see that says is for all y, if y is a dessert, then x loves y. Now note that we have to use a different variable here. We need to use y because we're not saying that x loves himself, and we're certainly not saying that x is a dessert. Right, so we need a new variable to indicate that this is not necessarily the same object as the sugar fiend with which we started. So the only thing left to do at this point is to translate x loves y, and that's a very, very straightforward thing. That's just a simple two-place predicate, which we've seen before. And that looks exactly like this. And that's our translation. So let's just talk through the whole thing now to make sure we understand the big picture. What that says is for all x, if x is a sugar fiend, then for all y, if y is a dessert, x loves y. And you can see that that maps pretty closely with the meaning of the English statement, every sugar fiend loves every dessert. Quite often, we pull that universal quantifier for all y to the beginning of the universal statement. That's called the prenex form of this expression. But this is exactly the same statement as the one we saw before. But it's just phrased slightly differently, but it means the same thing. So what this says is for all x and for all y, if x is a sugar fiend and y is a dessert, then x loves y. So it expresses exactly the same meaning. So that's equivalent to the formulation we saw on the previous slide. So now let's look at cases of multiple existential quantifiers. Here's an example. A student read a syllabus. So now we'll tackle this using the tools from previous lessons as we did with the universal statement, and it'll get you ultimately to a place where there's multiple quantifiers. So if we just tackle this like one of the problems we've seen in the past as a first approximation and recognizing that it's not fully translated yet, we can see that this says there exists at least one x such that x is a student and x read a syllabus. As before, we know how to translate x read a syllabus. That's going to say there exists a y such that y is a syllabus and x read y. And once again, we get to a simple two-place predicate, in this case x red y, which we just translate this way. So if we read this literally, what it says is, there exists at least one x such that x is a student, and there exists at least one y such that y is a syllabus, and x read y. And once again, we get to a simple two-place predicate, in this case x read y, which we just translate this way. As before, there's a pre-next form where we pull all the quantifiers to the front of the expression. In this case, we read this as, there exists an x and there exists a y such that x is a student and y is a syllabus, and x read y. Okay, before turning to mixed quantifiers, let me give you a few pointers or nuances about translating. Here's the first. If you have something like the expression you see there on the left, there is some x such that x loves x, this is basically expressing what's sometimes called a reflexive relationship. So this says, someone loves himself. Contrast that with the following expression. There exists some x and there exists some y such that x loves y. A natural way to understand this is that x and y are not the same person. However, strictly speaking, this expression in first-order logic doesn't say either way whether x and y are the same thing. They could be or they couldn't be, so you can't jump to any conclusions on that front. Okay, let's turn to a second nuance involved in translating with the same quantifier. And this is simply to be mindful of the scope of the quantifier. If we look at this expression here, what it says is, there exists an x and a y such that x is to the left of y, and there also exists an x and y such that x is not to the left of y. So it's really tempting to think that x and y in both the left-hand conjunct and the right-hand conjunct have to be referring to the same thing. But that's not accurate. Essentially, the conjunct means that you're resetting, and those are new variables that we have on either conjunct. So for example, you might think of this statement as being made true by four distinct objects. Let's say a skeleton, a parrot, a T-Rex, and a cat. And you can see that would be made true because the skeleton is to the left of the parrot, so that makes the first conjunct true. And the cat is not to the left of the T-Rex, which makes the second statement true. And that's one of many ways in which you could make that statement true. Now let's look at a statement that on the surface looks very similar to the previous statement, but is in fact very, very different. Whereas the previous statement said, there exists an x and a y such that x is to the left of y, and there exists another x and y such that x is not to the left of y. This says there exists a single pair of x and y such that x is both to the left of y and not to the left of y. That's obviously a contradiction, and what I hope this shows you is that you really do need to be very mindful of the scope of the quantifier. Okay, let's turn to mixed quantifiers now. So this will be where we have multiple quantifiers, and one of them is universal and one of them is existential. Let's start with a case in which the universal quantifier is on the outside, as it were, and the existential is on the inside. So here's a very old song by Dean Martin called Everybody Loves Somebody. In fact, it goes, everybody loves somebody sometime, but we won't deal with that. And just so you know, I am not so old that I am a Dean Martin fan. To express that everybody loves somebody in first-order logic, we say, for all x, there exists at least one y, such that x loves y. Now let's look at a case where the existential quantifier is on the outside and the universal is on the inside. Here would be a very simple variation on the Dean Martin song. Instead of everybody loving someone, let's say someone loves everything. All we do here is invert the order of the quantifiers. So we say there exists at least one x such that for all y, x loves y. Okay, as before, I want to get into some nuances with mixed quantifiers and their translation in English. One thing that I want you to pay very close attention to, and a good advice to think about, is keep the quantifiers as close to the variables as they govern as makes sense. So let's look at two examples which are very, very similar on their surface structure, but say things that are very different. So here's something that makes a good deal of sense. We understand what it says. All lovers are happy. The way we translate that is, for all x, if x loves y, then x is happy. So let's just assume that there's a universe in which there are only two people, Jack and Jill. And it turns out that Jack loves Jill. Then this conditional says that Jack is thereby happy. Pay very close attention to the expression in orange. Note that first we have a parenthesis, and then we have an existential quantifier. What we're going to now do is invert those, and you're going to see that it has a very, very different sense in terms of the meaning. What this says is, for all x, there exists some y such that if x loves y, then x is happy. What is that in English? Super weird. So here is my best attempt to express this in English. It's something along the lines of, everyone has something that if they loved it, it would make them happy. For instance, let's go back to that universe in which only Jack and Jill exist. But let's assume Jack doesn't love Jill in this universe. This statement might still be true because what it says is, if Jack came to love Jill, he would be happy.
Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lesson.